Hello. Hello. Today I'm going to tell you the story of how I built this somewhat soundproof recording space behind me for under $2,000. Okay, I'm not good at talking to the camera, so I may not look at it all the time. Here goes. Hello, how's it going? My name's Jacob. I'm a multi-instrumentalist, music producer, composer, and all-around creative dude from Brisbane, Australia. I don't need to say that because I already said it in the intro. You know why you're here. Part 1. Planning, research, and cleanup. For a long time, I have dreamt of a space where I can have my drums and any other instruments set up, ready to go, so that when I have an idea, I can quickly and efficiently record it. I considered hiring a space where I could have my own little studio set up, but it was going to cost way more than I wanted to spend yearly to rent a dedicated space. Additionally, with hiring a space, there were a lot more logistical problems involved, so I came up with a plan. This story begins with one of my favorite filmmakers, a creative thinker, philosopher, and YouTuber, Bo Miles. Quick note, I love his films and the way he thinks/expresses himself when talking about his passion. During the pandemic, Bo built a small cabin/office under a tree for his wife, using only materials he had collected over the years. He loves to repurpose old materials, especially wood, into something new and useful. This is something we both share a passion for. Jump forward in time. I had the pleasure of meeting Bo at a secret screening he did in Brisbane. I got to show him the finished space and let him know how much of a big inspiration he was for how I would execute the building of my own space. Jump back in time. At the start of the project, I didn't really know how I would execute my idea, so I needed to do some research. As building a room for recording music is a lot different than building just a general purpose space for living, but there are many similarities. For about 6 to 11 weeks, between the 14th of the 12th, 2022 and the 6th of the 3rd, 2023, I started planning and researching the cheapest way I could execute my plan. But I needed a plan, so I started learning about the basics of wooden frames like you see in a house. I did have a basic understanding of how to put a wall together before undertaking this project. An example I've had for a long time is the walls in our shed. You can see the stud work as there's no walls covering it on the inside. Additionally, I had watched Bo's video and he had walked everyone through all the different woods he chose and what it was for. Furthermore, I have built many different things out of wood over my life and had two of the best mentors I could in my pop and dad. By doing this learning and research, it helped to give me a deeper understanding of how I would execute on this project. As I was researching, I was also simultaneously creating 3D designs of the space and pricing out material. This was so I could answer a few questions. How big did I want the space? Where could I put the space? Would it fit where I wanted to put it? Are the ceilings too high or low, etc.? How much material I would need to buy / the price of everything. As well as trying to visualize everything beforehand so that when I started building, there was no surprises because I forgot to buy something or plan it out. Here are some 3D designs I did. It ended up with about 6 versions, but I'm sure with all the iterations and saves I did in each project file, it could have been about 40 versions. I started out my planning with the space ending up in my back garden, but after finally running the idea past my parents, yes, I live with my parents, renting a place is expensive, we came to the conclusion of putting the space on the back deck / veranda / porch. So that ended up changing the plans and the layout again. But this is the version I finally settled on. Fits in the space on the back deck with a good gap to the walls. It's large enough that it doesn't cover the entrance to the house and tall enough that pretty much anyone under 6.5 feet tall wouldn't hit their head on the door frame or ceiling. In tandem with the design and planning of the space, I was also researching room acoustics and soundproofing, as I wanted the space to be as soundproof as possible within my budget. True soundproofing is something that is very expensive to do. I didn't have the money for that. But in the end, I did achieve a level of soundproofing that I was surprised and happy with. I do need to do some more tests and add some extra stuff to soundproof it better, but for the moment it works well enough that I can play drums during the day and not really bother anyone much. It sounds like the drums are off in the distance. But why is soundproofing so expensive? D.I.Y. Here are some ways to soundproof a space that I have learnt during my research. Take this with a grain of salt, as I am not a professional, but this is how I have understood the research I did. One way is you either need a lot of mass to absorb vibrations, like how cars are soundproofed using mass-loaded vinyl to dampen vibrations and road noise, or you need a way to create an inner structure and an outer structure to create a room within a room, to stop any vibrations, because sounds are just vibrations in the air from escaping the space. You also need to separate these rooms using rubber to isolate them from each other. You can then fill the air gap in between with different materials, so vibrations have a harder time traveling through the wall. Here's an example. So with materials being expensive, and with my space constraints, it would not have been possible/feasible to build a proper soundproof room. I also didn't want the structure to weigh too much, as it was being built on a deck, a very well-built deck, but still just a deck, or a porch, or whatever else you call it in the world. For my soundproofing, I set it on this insulation, as well as blocking as many gaps as possible to stop sound from leaking out. It has good thermal performance, so it will help keep the space cooler in summer and very cold in the winter. It has been really cold during winter mornings in this space. But most importantly, it has good acoustic property, helping to absorb the sound as much as it can. For additional soundproofing, I tried to add as many layers between the inside and outside so the vibrations get absorbed a bit more, but I'll show you that more in the build phase. Now that I had a space where I could build the studio, I needed to make room to actually build the space. We had been using the back deck as a kind of storage area for old furniture we weren't sure what we wanted to do with yet, and didn't want it to just throw it out to be taken to landfill. At this point, we decided a lot of it we would just need to get rid of or move to a new location. But this is where my instincts for reusing old materials kicked in, and I realized a lot of the furniture was made out of particle board. It is cheap, but can be quite dense and heavy. This is great for absorbing vibrations. So I took apart any of the old furniture that I thought may be useful in this project. This helped to clear the space and also helped with my budget, as I had more materials to work with. Then gave everything a good clean and sanded back the railing. I gave the railings a few coats of varnish as they were in need of a makeover. Part 2. Foundations and walls 1, 2, and the front wall. This is bloody video essay, like 4,000 bloody words. I will find the actual number. Now that I had a plan and knew how much material I would need, I started on the foundations. My first round of material purchases was chipboard flooring, pinewood framing, timber, both treated and untreated, 2 sheets of plasterboard, the brand name in Australia is Gyprock, nails and screws, cut to time-lapse. The foundations were built over 2 afternoons, as I was on holiday from work over Christmas time/New Year. Also during the first build phase, I spent a bit of time preparing materials that I had salvaged from old furniture, so that they were ready to use, removing nails and staples or any screw. During the planning/design phase, I wasn't 100% sure what I was going to put on the outside of the space. Even though the deck doesn't get much rain or really anything that might damage the space, I still wanted to have as much waterproofing/protection on the outside as possible. I was contemplating the idea of plastic corrugated cladding or some sort of plastic staggered cladding. Here are some examples. I still can't speak, but this was adding hundreds more to the budget that I didn't really want to have to spend. I didn't want to have to spend $1 million. Then I remembered we had some leftover roofing tin from when we got the roof of our house redone back in the early 2000s. So these metal sheets became the outer layer of 2 of the walls. They needed a good cleaning, as they had been sitting under the house for more than 20 years. Cut to the B-roll. The first wall. Also during that first purchase, I bought enough material to build the first wall of the space. Because I had my plans and I had laid out how wide I wanted each joist to be, it made putting together the first wall really easily. I took the dimensions of the insulation and used that to space my joists out as evenly as possible. This also helped so that the insulation would fit nice and snugly once I was at that stage. Once I had the frame done, it was time to add the plasterboard to the outside wall. For some of the outside walls, I chose a plasterboard that was designed to be used in bathrooms. It wasn't 100% water resistant. It had more of a solid core to facilitate putting tiles on it, so it could carry a bit more weight than traditional plasterboard. At this point, I had decided how I was going to layer the walls to absorb as much vibrations as possible, as well as keep any water out. This is what I ended up with, starting from the outer layer to the inside wall. So it went roofing tin, plastic sheeting or blue plastic insulation sheeting stapled to the plasterboard. Most of the time I used both just to be sure no water was getting through. Had plasterboard, the wood frame, insulation between the studs, plasterboard again, and then paint. For the first wall, this is the order I used to create it. Went wood frame, plasterboard on the outside, blue plastic insulation, then tin, going from the inside out. I don't have any footage of putting plasterboard on the first wall as I was quite exhausted at that point, so I forgot to film it. But there's tons of footage from the other walls, so I'm sure I cut to that. Part 3, the rear wall and the front wall. The next wall I built was the rear wall, as it was nearly identical construction to the first wall. It was also easier for one person to build on their own, me. The only difference with the rear wall was that I didn't need to use any roofing tin. This was because it would be facing the rear wall of the house and it would be well isolated from the elements. So I just doubled up on the protective plastic. One layer of blue house insulation and another of some black plastic to keep out any water. So this was also stapled to the plasterboard that had been screwed to the wood frame. Quick side note, as of writing this on the 10th of the 8th 2023, it's been doing really well with no water damage and has become the home for a brush-tailed possum that sleeps behind Studio B when it feels like it. Here's a picture. As of right now, on the 26th of October 2023, at 1:50 p.m, we haven't seen the possum for 2 weeks, so I hope it's okay. The front wall. The next step in my plan was to build the front wall. This was going to be one of the hardest parts to complete as there was a lot of different elements that I wanted/needed to incorporate. I wanted to add windows, as I wanted a good amount of natural light in the space sometime. At this point, the 18th of the 9th, 2023, I haven't really used the windows, but they are good to have just in case. I also needed to add some ventilation holes so I could get fresh air into the space, but not let any outside elements in. So I started with framing out this wall, taking into account the window's dimension. I had 2 old windows in our house that I wanted to incorporate in the space. Again, reusing what we had around saved money. Now that I had the dimensions of the windows, I could incorporate that into the framing as well. Additionally, I used the dimensions of the insulation to lay out the bottom studs. In the end, this is how it ended up. 4 spaces at the bottom of the frame for insulation, 2 smaller spaces on each side of the window for insulation. We decided to put the window in sideways in the space, as that is something you do not traditionally see with the kinds of windows we had. Then smaller spaces above and below the window to support it, and have something to screw the window frame into. For the window frame, I used old hardwood bed slats, as my parents had got a new bed during this time, and we didn't want to throw them away. Again, reusing materials and giving them a new life. The next step was to add plasterboard to the outside, again using the bathroom rated stuff to help the water and sound. Added some black plastic to protect it from any water, as well as some blue insulation plastic to the outside. I then needed to add the ventilation holes. This was a difficult task as the vents I had purchased only really had one way to mount them, and this mounting method would be too fiddly and not work for my application. So I ended up building little frames for the vent and finding the tiniest screws I could and drilled little holes in each corner to mount them to the front wall. It was a kind of bodged job, but I am able to open and close the vents as needed, and I haven't had any problems with them. Again, I added more tin to the outside. This wall was like a puzzle with the tin, as I didn't have enough big sheets to cover the whole face of the wall, but I realized we had some leftover small corrugated tin from the surroundings of our old kitchen, so I pieced together whatever tin I could find and made it work. Part 3. The last wall and the ceiling. To finish off the outer structure, all I had left was the main wall and the ceiling. But before I started work on the last wall, I needed to find a door, as this would dictate a lot of how the wall would be constructed. I found an old door that was part of a set of 2 French doors from my grandparents' old house. It still has some stickers that myself and my siblings must have put on when we were little. Now that I had a door, I could start building the last wall. I decided to build the last wall in 2 sections. On the right, we had a section of wall that would receive a window, and on the left, we just had an empty blank wall that would just get insulation and plasterboard. In between, I left space for the door now that I had the dimensions for it. I didn't put the top plate of the walls on straight away, as I wanted to use one long piece to tie all the different joists together into one structure. Additionally, this helped if I needed to move the walls slightly to accommodate the door. Once we knew the door would fit, we added the top plate and tied the final wall into the structure. The next step was to start building the frame for the window. I used the same bed slat hardwood for this window frame as well. This didn't take long as we had the experience from the first window and applied it here. The next job was the door frame and mounting the door. We added a top plate to the door at the right height, as most doors are not 7 or 8 feet tall. We then added a frame on the outside to fill as much space between the wall frame and the door. This is what the door frame ended up looking like. We were having trouble fitting the door and measured it and realized that it wasn't square. One side of the bottom edge was about 2 centimeters longer than the other after being worn away over years of use. So we chopped off the bottom to make it square again. Now we knew the door would fit and had all the framing work done. It was time to add the plasterboard to the outside. This had to be done in lots of long and small sections because of the door and window frame. The next job was to frame in the final vent for the wall. Lots of problem solving later, and I came up with this. Then added the blue insulation to the outside wall, taking out the inner door and window frame so that the plastic could wrap around and be as watertight as possible. The next structural work to complete was the ceiling. This was one of the hardest structural things to do, as I didn't really think about how I would attach the joist to the rest of the structure. In the end, I used long screws and screwed at an angle onto the rest of the frame. This has worked well as it is not load bearing, so it doesn't carry any weight at all really. I've been using the top of the space for storage, here's an example, and I haven't had any problems with the roof moving or being damaged. Once I had the ceiling framing done, I added some plasterboard to one side and blue plastic. I would need to do this in sections, as this was the most efficient way to use the plasterboard I had, as well as the safest and easiest road to get to the finish line. Once the plasterboard for the roof was done, I added some more blue insulation material and some white plastic to protect it from water. We used some leftover blocks of wood to hold the plastic down and keep it tight. I also added a couple blocks of wood in the middle to have a high point. So if any water did leak onto it, it would hopefully get moved off by the slope of the plastic. Our next step was to test fit the front door and the side window. I had some fine-tuning adjustment, but ended up getting it to work. At this point, I hadn't decided what I was going to put on the entrance wall of the space. I wanted something as cheap as possible. I love using pallet wood for projects, as businesses give them away for free. It's a very soft pine wood, but usually is treated so it doesn't rot too quickly. I wanted to do a cladding style wall on the outside to make the space look like a cabin or small shed. This is when I thought maybe I could use some pallets to make the cladding. I did some research and found lots of people had done this before. Here are some examples. So on my next trip to my local hardware shop, I picked up some pallets that they were giving away for free. I then spent the next few days, or maybe a week, I can't really remember how long it took to disassemble all the pallets. This was not fun work and can take a long time, but it is satisfying in the end to see all the wood you have to work with. During this trip to the hardware store, I also purchased the insulation that would go on the inside walls. Adding the insulation. My next step was to add the insulation to the inside wall. This was an itchy process, but worked great in the end for such a small space. It helped to absorb a lot of vibrations, as well as helped to regulate the temperature of the space. I used some leftover plastic to staple it to the joist to keep the insulation in place. One of the last construction jobs for the inside was to cover all the walls with plasterboard and any leftover pieces I had. I then started on the front wall, piecing together whatever plasterboard I had left to put it together, as I knew I was going to need to fill the gaps anyway with wall filler. This front wall was a very patchwork job, but with some wall filler and paint you don't really notice at all. For the next wall I had some thick sheets of flooring left over from the floor frame. This worked great as they are nice, thick and heavy. I also used old particle board panel from an old wardrobe that was once on the back deck, as well as some particle board from an old chest of drawers that was also on the back deck. With whatever leftover plasterboard I had, I used it to fill in the side wall as much as possible. I had a little accent section to the back wall to give the wall some variations. It also helped with the room's acoustics, so the sound could be bounced around off something that wasn't plasterboard or particle board. Additionally, it has been a great place to screw hooks in for holding cables. I was also running out of materials, so I just used what I had, but I think it turned out great. The next job was the ceiling, adding more insulation and plasterboard. I used staples to hold the insulation to the roof, and it worked great. I ended up having more insulation than I needed, but it worked well as I used it later for another part of the build of the space. I added plasterboard to the ceiling. I don't have any footage of this, as it was very frustrating and took a while, but I did it with some help. It worked. Now it was time for the finishing work on the inside. This consisted of wall filler, sanding and painting. I started by filling all the gaps in all the walls and added some plasterboard tape to give the overlapping joints a little more strength. I added a little frame around the outside of the door to tie it into the rest of the outside wall, as I was planning on using pallet cladding on the outside. Then it was the long journey of cutting pallets to length and nailing or screwing them to the outside wall. Here's a bunch of footage. I ended up only doing one coat of paint on the inside of the space, as at this point I had spent about 3 months on this project and was pretty exhausted. I gave the space a washed out beach house look that I liked. I did some little touch-ups here and there for any spots I missed, but most of the space was done in one coat. I think I may have done 1 or 2 coats on the ceiling. I finished off the cladding over a couple of days, chopping as many pieces to length at the same time to be more efficient. The final step of the construction was the frames for the acoustic treatment. I had a couple lengths of pine left over to use as framing to hold the insulation, and I bought some fabric for the acoustic treatment. Additionally, I had some good strong pallet wood to use. Did a lot of research on acoustic treatment over the course of the project to see what might be the best solution for the space, as it is a small space for recording large acoustic instruments like a drum set. I ended up going with 6 corner bass traps to absorb as much bass build up, as this is common in small spaces as the sound/air pressure has nowhere to dissipate. And I also built a cloud to go over the drum kit to absorb any reflections from the ceiling. This solution has worked well for getting a tight, close and punchy drum sound. If I want to add more space to the drums, I have been adding a plug-in reverb on a send to my recordings. I didn't get any footage really of building the acoustic absorption, as I just wanted to finish and use the space. But I may do another video explaining the process, as I think I may need to change out the insulation. I also watched a lot of videos on the process of creating acoustic absorption, and will link anything I can remember watching below, as it was very interesting. Final step of the process was to clean up and bring my drums in. Present day. What's the date? 26th of October, 2023. I've done lots of little upgrades since finishing the space, like adding shelves to store items and audio equipment, as well as adding hooks to hang stuff. I'm really happy with the space. It works just like I wanted. Not as soundproofed as I thought it would be. It is the best I could do with the budget/space requirements I had. You'll see lots more videos of me using this space, hopefully. Really hope you enjoyed. I really hope you consider subscribing. Thank you all for watching. How long did that take? Under $2,000. And Bo's video. To be sure no water was getting through.